That was a no.
Okay, so welcome again, class. We're in lesson 2. We're looking at the leadership of Moses. Going to our outline, this is where we are. We just looked at a general description of what biblical leadership is. We did some contrast as to what it is, what it isn't, compared it to what we consider conventional or secular leadership. So now we're going to be looking at the first one of the examples of biblical leadership that we'll be doing. So right now we're looking at Moses. We're also going to be looking at David, Paul, and of course the ultimate leader, Jesus Christ. Okay, there's basically two things that really define all God-led leaders. The first one is obedience to the will of God. Problem is, since we're all human, we all fail at some point in time as we try to, obey what God's will is and even to try to figure it out. But really, how we react to that failure is whether it determines whether we're going to be an effective leader or not. One example that I just heard recently that he pointed out was like, okay, you look at what happened, when Jesus was going to the cross. Judas, he made a big goof. He thought he could force Jesus' hand. But instead of going and admitting that he made a mistake and asking forgiveness, he killed himself. Peter denied Christ 3 times. But he sought forgiveness and he got grace, and he became the leader of the church, after Christ ascended back up into heaven. So just the difference, we're all going to fail. Is how we handle the failure. A conventional leadership thing is, we're all going to fail. You're going to fall down, but what happens, if you get up after you fall down? Kind of the same thing. Again, a case where somebody doing the following what they think is conventional leadership is actually following biblical leadership because they've been afforded some grace to keep going. The second thing that's a defining characteristic of a God-led leader is reliance on God. We touched on that briefly when we were looking at it before, is that as we're out doing our ministries, we have to rely on God to provide things at times. Sometimes it's to provide the idea of what we need to do, how we're going to get something done. Sometimes it's more physical things that we need, whether it's food for the breakfast on the mornings that we're trying to serve the people, or whether it's like a bigger church type thing. It's like, hey, we've grown so big, we need the money to expand, or we need the land. We've gone way beyond what we can do here. We need more land. And again, there's all sorts of stories you hear out there where, when somebody basically says, God, it's your church. We need this, and we can't do it on our own power. And you see the miracles that happen. It's like, wow, where'd that come from? One example there is where I went to seminary, Golden Gate, Golden Gate Seminary. It was based up in Mill Valley. And now they have they decided, that they were having some troubles up there trying to expand. I mean, the facility they had up there was just absolutely gorgeous. It was right on the bay. You could look across the Golden Gate Bridge, and you could see the San Francisco skyline. It was gorgeous grounds up there, but they were having trouble getting permission to do the things they needed to keep the facility going. So they decided they're going to move it. So now their new main campus is going to be down here in Southern California, actually out in Ontario. And then they were trying to figure out, okay, we still want to keep a presence up in the Bay Area because that's where a lot of people are used to it. So they still want to maintain a presence up there. So they were looking around trying to find what they could do to get the land they needed, because they've got like a 2-year time now to get things transitioned from up there to down here. Well, turns out there was a church up there that had decided they were going to go mostly to the home type meetings instead of meeting at their facility. They actually had a pretty good sized campus apparently. That church gave Golden Gate all their property. So now Golden Gate has a place to move their property, their presence and stay in the Bay Area. And one of the things that they talked about was that they were just depending on God to provide what they needed, and sure enough, He did it. And a lot quicker than anybody expected them to be able to find the place up there. Okay. This kind of follows the points in your courseware. I just kind of summarized it or reworded it a little bit and definitely shortened it on the slides. So the first thing we see is that God selects, prepares, and trains His chosen leaders. Well, Moses was basically selected early on because he was saved from the Pharaoh's decree to go kill all the Hebrew babies. He got put out in his little raft there and picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. Not bad. Okay, his training was actually trained, as an Egyptian prince. He was trained, in the palace there of the pharaohs. So he knew what it was, He knew conventional leadership. Pharaoh was conventional leadership. Basically very dictatorial. All that, but he was trained in that way. Now, actually, we see this kind of thing happen a lot. An example I was thinking of is, just last semester we were talking about Daniel. He was taken away. He was trained, in Babylonian leadership. We've seen that in other cases. God sometimes will use non-biblical leaders and non-biblical entities of some kind to help train His people because He's got a particular use for that. Egypt actually did this. A couple people were trained in Egypt. But what does this give him? Well, when he gives back, he knows how things work. He knows, pretty much what to expect from the Egyptians. So he's got that in his mind. The other way I look at it is when we go into the New Testament, we're going to be looking at Paul. Paul was the Hebrew of Hebrews. He also was raised, from Greek parents, so he knew that, was familiar with the Greek commerce that was going on. He was also a Roman citizen, so he knew how the Roman government worked. So he had all that going for him too. Not all of that was biblical, but God had him trained in that so he could use that for God's work. And as we talked about last time, a lot of biblical leaders back in these days, actually were shepherds at one point in time. Well, after Moses got kicked out of Egypt and he went over there and he was in Midian, he actually served as a shepherd for about 40 years. And then, of course, we finally got to the point where he was commissioned at the burning bush there. So, we talked about him being, the Egyptian prince. He learned how things worked, in the leadership there. Well, when he was working as a shepherd, first he learned how to take care of the sheep, and that taught him then how to take care of people. He had to learn that first because he, going from the dictatorial type leadership of the palace of the pharaoh, had to get his mind changed and his whole way of thinking. Okay, well, leaders listen and they wait patiently on God. It took 40 years to prepare from the time he left Egypt until he got that call to say, okay, time to be deployed now, let's get going. See that, a lot of times we've seen where it takes a lot more time than we would think would be necessary for him to train people and get them ready for things. Even when you hear some of these stories about, people in our day that are, in high positions in the church, you find out that, they were doing other things and learning this, learning that, and it took a long time before they were brought into this position. Because it takes a while sometimes. Some of us take longer to train than others. But then, we talk, okay, he was patient. It took 40 years to get to that point. Well, then he led the people for another 40 years, as they were roaming around the desert. That takes quite a bit of patience. And he was still learning at that time, too. He had learning how to deal with their complaints and their problems. He had to learn how to handle some of these various situations that they were run into. Okay, and leaders, they learn to trust God's power and not their own. Moses was kind of reluctant, to take on that leadership role. He's in there, what, me? What? I don't speak that well, Nah, it can't be me you want to do this. Look, I'm 80 years old. You can't be doing this. Nah. So, actually, it turns out reluctance is kind of a good thing. You kind of have to be aware of, a lot of times, of people that are a little bit too eager to want to be the leader. Because maybe they're looking at it from the conventional leadership thing, and they're really more after the power or the title or whatever than they are really about being a biblical leader. I've heard many people talk about that people that are leaders now, they run into that where somebody's up there, it's like, oh, I want to lead this, I want to lead that. And it's like, you're a little bit too eager there. Let's get you doing something over here and see how it goes. And a lot of times, because what they really wanted was the title, they disappear. So yeah, I've even seen that happen a few times too. So it's, you don't want somebody that's too reluctant. But then again, I guess you look at what we looked at even when we were looking at the prophets. Most of the prophets weren't exactly eager to be appointed a prophet either. Of course, then again, having that 100% accuracy thing, that's that's enough to make you a little reluctant anyway. So, a little bit reluctant. And even as you find out a lot of leaders, even when they're in that position, they're still thinking, I'm not really adequate at this. Should I really be doing this? I mean, Billy Graham, how many times has he said, he just wishes he could do more and he doesn't feel really adequate for what he's done. He's one of the greatest evangelists of our time, but he still feels inadequate for what he's done. Feels like he should have done more. That's kind of a healthy attitude to maintain, as long as you don't think you've achieved it. Paul even said that, I don't think I've got these nailed yet. He wrote most of the New Testament. Moses doubted his own ability. He wasn't real sure. In fact, he was so insistent about that God provided Aaron to be the spokesperson. Said, okay, you need somebody that can speak. Okay, take your brother along. Then you find out that actually, Aaron did do a lot of it, but eventually Moses was doing a lot of talking too. But he had to have that for just to get him going. Which kind of ties into this third point about God reassured Moses of his power by miracles. When he was still trying to convince him, he said, okay, throw that staff down. And it became a snake, and then it came back, and he took out your hand, got leprous, and that got healed. It was like, yeah, I got your back here. I can provide the power that you really need to get these things done that I'm asking you to do. Another nice, interesting quote that I found here. It's a little bit long, so some of you a little further away from the screen might not be able to see it, but it says, a true and safe leader is likely to be one who has no desire to lead, but is forced into a position of leadership by the inward pressure of the Holy Spirit and the press of the external situation. Such were Moses and David and the Old Testament prophets. I think there was hardly a great leader from Paul to the present day, but that was drafted by the Holy Spirit for the task. and commissioned by the Lord of the church to fill a position he had little heart for. I believe it might be accepted as a fairly reliable rule of thumb that the man who is ambitious to lead is disqualified as a leader. The true leader will have no desire to lord it over God's heritage, but will be humble, gentle, self-sacrificing, and altogether as ready to follow as to lead, when the Spirit makes it clear that a wiser and more gifted man than himself has appeared. And again, like I say, we saw this in the prophets. We see it all along. And it's also part of what we're talking about is, preparing somebody to take your position. Because that makes it so you can move on, you can keep learning, you can keep answering the call. And, no matter how high we get in leadership in ministry, like I said, we're always at least one we have to answer to. And that's God himself. Now, most biblical leaders also have a group of people around them that they consult with. They have some maybe people that mentor them, and maybe they're mentoring some people. They have people they can bounce things off of, but never going to get to the point where we want to say we got all it takes to be a leader. We don't need to learn anymore. We don't need anybody. Forget it all. We're just going to do it on our own. At that point, you're going to find yourself getting shut down because God won't tolerate it. Okay, we need to learn to follow God's direction, even when it seems counterintuitive. This is a big one, because most of the time, what we think is the way to be going is probably just the exact wrong one. We listen to what God, if we're listening to God, doing what He says, this doesn't make any sense at all. But you follow it, you do it, and you find out, yeah, He really does know what He's talking about. The path through the Red Sea was not the direct path for the Promised Land. But He needed time to get out there. These guys had been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. They weren't ready to be a nation yet. So they needed a little time and a little bit of safety. If they'd have gone the direct route, they would have had to immediately gone into battle against the Philistines. Probably wouldn't have turned out good unless God would have done another major miracle at that point. And at that point, I think, God was more interested in developing them into a nation than He was about delivering a military victory. He had to still was developing Moses as a leader, and he had to get the people used to having a biblical leader rather than, the tyrants that they had from Egypt. Plus, as we're going to find out, they had to develop some more leaders too. They were used to the fact that what Pharaoh says goes, and they were used to having their slave drivers, but they were always taking orders. None of them were really doing much of any leading. So he had to have some time to develop them into a nation and develop some leaders. And of course, confronting Pharaoh was kind of counterintuitive. Usually, if you went up against Pharaoh or any of the leaders, of the other nations around there at the time, usually didn't end up good for you. You usually ended up dead in one form or another. Depending, the only difference would be how painful the process was. So it's pretty counterintuitive for Moses to go in there and just walk up to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." Okay. Leaders learn that God always leads in the midst of His people. Which, this reminds me actually of something. There actually are a few typos I found in the thing. I think in the book it says in the midst of His people. But it should be midst. And while I'm thinking about it, when he talks about Moses in the desert of Midian, I think there's a misspelling there. They ended up Median in Midianites instead of Midianites. So anyway, back to the point here. God was with the people in the cloud and the pillar of fire. He was among them all this time. And of course, what they don't mention there is, when they had the ark, that was supposed to be his spot. He was supposed to come in when he would come and visit, he'd sit there. So that was right among the people also. So he was always among them. He was also there through Moses. And of course, Moses was pretty much always leading from the front. Okay, I think we're back. So Moses was always leading from the front, but there were times that he didn't. Like when he was standing up, holding up his arms. That's because he was giving somebody else a chance to lead. He also had people helping him hold up his arms. Okay, now we start looking at some of the teaching aspects of biblical leadership. These are things that we learn, when we look at Moses' leadership. It's the way God generally likes to do things. Then you might hear something, or kind of a variety on it is, God doesn't elect the equipped, he equips the elected. He's going to pick somebody that's available, like we talked about in the last session. You got to be available, and then he's going to give you what you need to do the job that he's got for you. Might not necessarily pick the person that might look like they've got the most credentials or whatever to do this job, because they might not be the right person. They might not have the right attitude. They might be looking at things more from a conventional leadership role than the person that's actually available to do it that God can train. Again, another one like we looked at, you got to be teachable. Somebody that might have all the technical capabilities might say, hey, I got this on my own. I don't need God to do this. And that's not the type of leader God wants. That's conventional leadership. God wants somebody that's going to listen to him. So we talked about this before. Moses learned the ways of the Egyptian leadership as a prince of Egypt. Then he learned to trust and rely on God in the Midian desert. First of all, just by getting across the desert, when he was kicked out of Egypt and getting to Midian, he had to trust God, because the reason that they turned him loose out there was they didn't think he was going to survive. So he had to just trust God just to get to where he could find some food and some water. And at that point then he had to trust in God that, God wants to have something for me to do while I'm sitting out here in the middle of nowhere with all these darn sheep. And then once he was commissioned and he was leading the people, then he was taught the law, and then he had to then pass that law on to the people. So God taught him the law, and then he had to figure out how to teach the people the law, again following the way that God had taught him. Look at the delegating aspect of biblical leadership. This is something that a lot of leaders have a lot of trouble with. Basically, Moses learned pretty early on that he couldn't do it all, and he had to delegate. And new leaders especially have trouble with this. They figure, I got to do it all. I've got to do it all. If I want it done right, I got to do it. And unfortunately, some people, they never get rid of that idea, even when they've moved on up and up and up. But first of all, nobody's got all the talents that are needed to be done, so they're going to need to delegate just to have somebody, like that earlier slide said, when you find somebody that's better at it, you let them do that. And plus, you just don't have enough time to handle all the problems. You need somebody else to do that. The idea of being, whatever level you're in leadership is you handle the important stuff that only you can do, and you get people to help you with the stuff that they're good at doing, so everything gets done. In this case, God used Jethro to teach Moses how to delegate. And we'll see that a lot of times, that God's going to use, others to do, help out with the teaching, or to, bring His word. He uses some of the strangest people sometimes to teach people things that you think, how the heck are they going to teach him that? But they do. Using the Babylonians. It's like, nah, that can't happen. But he did it. And Moses learned that delegation can multiply his effectiveness and give others a chance to grow in their leadership. Kind of a win-win situation. You get the help you need to get things done, and you're also developing other leaders. So you're also at that time preparing them so that they can go on into other leadership roles. Eventually, you might be training the person that's going to take your spot so you can move on up. Again, we talked about this, in the motel ministries. The idea is you're training somebody that, eventually that's one of the people that you're right now, serving, and eventually they're going to be taking over the leadership of that motel church. And then you can move on to the next one. If everything goes the way that it's planned, that's how it should work.
Well, I think that Stu and I kind of experienced something like that because we were both at the Tropic, and it's a smaller motel. It only has like 15, 20 rooms, and then I don't know, I think we were there a couple months, and then Stu was given the opportunity to go to another motel that was larger, remember? And so you moved on, and I stayed behind at the Tropic, but I learned a lot from Stu.
Mm-hmm.
He started this atmosphere, the fellowship and the closeness with all the people that, they really responded to. And so, that was one of the things that he left behind. And, he also gave me the opportunity to kind of keep it going and moving it forward.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess God, not Stu, but
Well, God working through Stu.
yeah, there you go.
Following, Stu was willing to listen to what God had said, move on to the next one, to be able to take that next assignment. He could have said, no, this is my motel church. I'm not going to move. I've got this thing going. I'm not going to move. You see that happen, unfortunately, in some places. People do that, mostly conventional, but occasionally, in churches and ministry, it's just like, no, this is mine, and I'm not going to give it up. But if you're willing to listen, you say, okay, not sure what's over there, but if that's where you want me, that's where I'll go. And then again, if you've done things right, you've got somebody like you to step in right behind it. And now you're developing people there too.
What if you try to delegate
It might make you want to take a look and see, but sometimes it's just, again, where you have to drop back and say, God, if you want this done, I need people to do it, and rely on Him to provide it. And it might not happen exactly at the time frame that you're looking for, and sometimes maybe that is a thing you need to back, say, okay, maybe things aren't, maybe the timing's not right at this point to do all the things we want to do, so maybe we do have to back off a little bit until we can get the people that are ready to take on these responsibilities. It might take a little bit of training or something, or building up the people, building up their confidence, thinking that they can do it. You kind of have to, it's one of those cases where something like that happens, just take it to God and say, hey, what gives? Yeah. 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 But the delegation, you can ask them.
No, that's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
I never try to delegate. I always inform people that
Right.
on what you are,
Right.
and if they have any time or energy in order to do those things,
Yeah.
because the needs are
Yeah.
there.
A lot of times, even like in our Saturday men's group, what we found out is if we ask, we say, hey, we've got this and this that needs done. We don't necessarily get volunteers, but if we kind of look and say, that person over there really has that, I'll bet they could do it. And if we go over and ask directly and say, hey, this needs done, we think you can do it. Could you do it? A lot of times, and most times, you're going to say, sure, we'll give it a shot. So sometimes it's just you know, because it shows that you've got confidence in them in the first place, that you think they can do it. And it's, personal asking. It's not like, hey, if there's anybody out there, would like to volunteer to do this. Because the other thing you run into that I've kind of found out by talking to, people as we've tried to do some of these things is a lot of people will figure if you're asking for, for a volunteer, or they'll think, somebody else will volunteer. There's somebody else, somebody will pick that up. I don't need to do that. Yeah. So this is what we have from Exodus 18:17-24 about the delegation. So what you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them the decrees and laws and show them the way to live and the duties they are to perform. But select capable men from all the people and appoint them as officials over the thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. So this is, just reinforcing what we talked about earlier, where you have to be able to delegate so that you can do the things that God wants you to do, and all the other stuff can be handled by other people. So it all gets done. Because if you try to do it all yourself, you might be able to pull it off for a while, but eventually you're going to burn out. It's just, there's no way that that's not going to happen. Because none of us have enough power to do everything, because God's visions are always bigger than we can think of. So there's a lot of stuff that needs done, and there's no way we're going to get it done all on our own. Okay, look at these as criteria for selecting potential leaders when you're out there trying to find somebody to do some of these things. This says, able men, obviously mean women too, but having strength and efficiency, God-fearing men showing reverence, godly humility and obedience, men of truth conforming to God's character, men that hate covetousness so they can't be bribed. And then it shows here that they were ranked, with rulers over them, so each man was to be accountable to someone else. Because they had the thousands, the hundreds, the fifties, the tens. So everybody's accountable. And when it finally got up, the biggest group was accountable to Moses, and he was accountable to God. So there's always somebody to be accountable to. You can't really be doing biblical leadership and not have accountability in there somewhere. Okay, there's also the enabling aspect of biblical leadership. He learned that by developing leaders or leadership in others, he prepared the next generation of leaders. He was 80 when he started this thing. So he knew he was going to have people that could follow on. He put people in positions that they could do better than he could by recognizing the talents of those people around him. Again, nobody's got all the skills that's required. That's why God, points out that, some people are good at this, some people are good at that. They talk about the gifts, people have different gifts so that everything can be done. If everybody had the same gift, if everybody had the gift of teaching, we'd all be teaching, but there'd be nobody to learn. There'd be nobody to, make the computers that we use when we do the teaching. Nobody would have built the house that we're standing in. So there's all sorts of different things that needed. So Moses, put those people in the position that he had to have. And he relied on God for the final selection. So basically God always has the final say on who's going to be the leader. You might have the person you think is going to be it, and when it gets to the point of the final selection, you get this position, this thought, it's like, I really thought that was the person for this, but God seems to be telling me that I should get that person to do it. So God always has the final say. So this is the the verses that kind of point that out in Numbers 11:16-17. The Lord said to Moses, "Bring me 70 of Israel's elders who are known to you as leaders and officials among your people. Have them come to the tent of meeting, that they may stand there with you. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take of the Spirit that is on you and put the Spirit on them. They will help you carry the burden of the people, so that you will not have to carry it alone." Interesting thing here, it talks about, when they are meeting there, first of all, they're people that others have recognized already as leaders. That's one way to help pick a leader, when a lot of people are coming up and saying, this person here, they're really, doing something good over here. They've been, maybe helping, after a class or something, explain some things, or, they've helped me get do this thing that we need to get done. They really know a lot about this. So a lot of times you find it just from listening to the people, the people that you're leading. They're the ones that are going to help you find the ones that you need to move up into these positions, to delegate some leadership responsibilities to. Also talks about, okay, God's going to take some of the spirit that he had, on Moses, and put that on these people so that they're spirit led too. So they're going to be having, this capability of knowing what God's will is for the leadership tasks that they've been given. This gets into the idea of succession. So we kind of look at how Moses prepared Joshua for the succession. He appointed Joshua to lead the battle against the Amalekites. Give him a little bit of experience that way. And then as he moved along, kept giving him increasingly more responsible tasks to develop his ability to lead. So he was developing slowly and slowly. He had a lot of time to do this, so he got him going. He sent him off as one of the spies into the land. One of the only two that came back with the report the way it should be. Then Moses obeyed God when he was told it was time to commission Joshua as the new leader. He didn't say, "Hey, I'm not getting damn way. I'm going to keep the leadership here. I'm the leader. No way I'm going to appoint him." But that helped the transition. It's one of the things you look at in the, when you're preparing somebody for succession. You got to let the people know that this is part of the plan. A lot of churches run into problems with this, especially if they're highly personality driven, that they don't come up with a plan for succession. The pastor gets to the point where he'd like to retire, and they don't have a way to do it. He just suddenly retires. They go out and pick somebody, and it's like, what happened here? The people weren't prepared for it. Well, Moses, by having Joshua doing all these progressively more and more responsible leadership positions, got him used to Joshua leading, and then at some point in time said, okay, God has said that Joshua is to be the next leader, and I'm commissioning him as that now. So it's very obvious, that this is the succession plan. It's a big part of it. Then there's these, 4 guidelines that he followed for preparing his successor. First you pray and ask God to help in selecting the potential new leader. You select, with the guidance of God and the Holy Spirit. Again, like I mentioned earlier, you might think, oh, it's that one, but then suddenly you get the, the Spirit kind of moving. You go, no, it's actually that one over there that's the best for this. Then once you've figured out who it's supposed to be, you develop and empower the selected future leader. That we got to look at that too, because a lot of times you'll see where somebody will maybe give somebody a title and say, oh yeah, they are, and that title kind of indicates that they're the heir apparent, but they don't give them the responsibilities to do it. They don't give them the power. They still have to come and ask for permission from the leader. So you have to watch that, because you gotta give, if you're going to give them the title of leader, you got to give them the responsibility and the power to do it too. And then you have to publicly commission and transfer the authority to the selected new leaders when it's time. So that's why a lot of times you see in a church, we're going to send somebody out to do something, we'll actually have a public commissioning. Just so it's like, yeah, this is the way it's supposed to be. It gets, people knowing that that's who it's supposed to be. It also is great for the person that's being sent because they know that they've got all these other people behind them too. That they know it's going to be what's going on. And that, I believe, is all we've got for looking at Moses as the biblical leader. So next week, we'll be looking at another one.